You could taste the desperation in the air. Thick, sour, like old sweat and fear. This wasn't a normal courtroom day. The gallery was packed, not with casual spectators, but with people whose futures hung on the verdict: uniformed nurses, orderlies, and weary-faced family members. And at the plaintiff's table sat a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a year. Maria Rodriguez, 54, head nurse of the Willow Creek Long-Term Care Facility. Her hands, usually steady enough to start in 4 in a dim room, were trembling as she clutched a thick binder to her chest. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Judith presiding. First case, Maria Rodriguez on behalf of the Willow Creek Staff Alliance versus Vincent Croft and NextGen Health Partners. The door to the right opened and the defendant entered. He didn't walk. He glided. Vincent Croft, CEO of NextGen, was all sharp angles and expensive fabric, a suit that whispered rather than spoke. He was in his late 40s, with the calm, sterile smile of a man who had just sold you something you didn't need. He took his seat, adjusted his platinum cufflinks, and scanned the room with the detached curiosity of a tourist visiting a zoo. His lawyer, a woman with a steel gray bob and a smile even colder than his, leaned in and whispered something. Croft nodded, his expression one of mild boredom. Judge Judith entered, her robe sweeping behind her. She took her seat and immediately fixed her gaze on the file before her. The room fell into a silence so deep you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Judith began, her voice neutral, probing. You are bringing a class action suit on behalf of 87 employees. You allege systematic wage theft, violation of break time laws, and punitive scheduling practices by NextGen Health Partners. You are seeking back pay, damages, and injunctive relief. Is that correct? Maria's voice was a rasp, but it carried. Yes, Your Honor, for 3 years. Judge Judith nodded. Mr. Croft, how does NextGen plead? Vincent Croft leaned slightly into his microphone. His voice was smooth, polished, a public radio host's tone. Not guilty, Your Honor. These claims are, frankly, disappointing. NextGen is a leader in compassionate care. We value our frontline heroes deeply. What we have here is a misunderstanding of complex payroll systems and a few disgruntled former employees. Judge Judith's eyebrow twitched just a millimeter. A misunderstanding affecting 87 people? That's quite a systemic misunderstanding. Croft's smile didn't falter. Healthcare billing and payroll are incredibly complex. Judge, when you're managing thousands of caregivers across the state, dedicated to our vulnerable seniors, occasional administrative errors can occur. We've always corrected them when brought to our attention. Maria Rodriguez flinched as if struck. She opened her mouth, but Judge Judith spoke first. Ms. Rodriguez, start from the beginning. What was the first administrative error? Maria took a shaky breath, opening her binder. It started small, Your Honor. In 2021, a few minutes shaved off each shift. The time clock system, it would round down. If you clocked out at 7:07 p.m., it paid you till 7 o'clock. Clock in at 6:53 a.m. It started you at 7 o'clock. They called it time clock optimization. She looked up, her eyes blazing. We're nurses. We don't leave at the bell. Mrs. Henderson needs her morphine at 7:05. Mr. Alvarez falls trying to get to the bathroom at 6:55. We stay. We care, and they stole that time. Croft chuckled softly, a dry, soundless laugh. Your Honor, this is a common industry practice. Fair labor standards allow for rounding. It balances out. It never balanced out. Maria's composure cracked, a fissure of raw anger. Then it was the missed breaks. The system would auto-deduct 30 minutes for a lunch we never took because we were short-staffed. When we complained, the manager said, "If you have time to complain, you have time to take your break," but there was no one to cover. We couldn't leave dementia patients alone. The gallery rumbled in agreement. A man in scrubs nodded fiercely, his jaw tight. Judge Judith held up a hand for silence. Her eyes were on Croft. "You mandated staffing levels that prevented legally required breaks." "We mandated efficient and compassionate care," Croft corrected, his tone taking on a patient, lecturing quality. Sometimes, in the flow of tending to our cherished residents, a caregiver might miss a formal break. The system is designed for flexibility. We trust our professionals to manage their time. "Your Honor," Maria interjected, her voice trembling with a new intensity. Then came the point system. Every time we were late from this stolen break, every time we called in sick because our own children were feverish, we got points. 8 points and you're fired. But the points, they never expired. Janet Miller, she's been with Willow Creek for 20 years. She got the flu in 2021, got points. Her car broke down in 2022, got points. She was 2 minutes late in 2023 because of an ice storm. They terminated her. 20 years. No pension, gone. A choked sob came from the gallery. An older woman buried her face in her hands. For the first time, Croft's polished mask showed a hairline fracture, a slight tightening around his eyes. Terminations are always the last resort, based on overall performance. We have a business to run, Judge. Reliability is key in healthcare. Judge Judith's pen had stopped moving. She was just watching him. "A business," she repeated, her voice flat. "A mission-driven business," Croft affirmed, spreading his hands. "We provide essential care. To do that, we must be financially viable. These lawsuits, these inflated claims, they threaten the very homes where these residents live. If NextGen is crippled by retroactive payments, facilities close. Jobs are lost. Who does that help? It's a tragedy of good intentions. Asterisk, the implication hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. If you rule against us, you're hurting the old people." The gallery erupted in outraged whispers. "He's threatening to close the home." Someone hissed. Judge Judith's voice sliced through the noise, quiet and deadly sharp. "Are you stating, for the record, Mr. Croft, that compliance with wage and hour laws would force you to shut down facilities?" Croft met her gaze, his own turning flinty. The genteel facade was peeling back, showing the calculated steel beneath. "I'm stating economic reality, Your Honor. Our margins are slim. Catering to every minor grievance is not sustainable. We make tough choices to keep the doors open. These employees," he gestured dismissively toward Maria and the gallery, "they benefit from those choices. They have jobs." Maria Rodriguez stood up. She wasn't tall, but in that moment she seemed to tower. The trembling was gone, replaced by a solid, furious strength. "We don't want your benefits, Mr. Croft. We want our wages. We want our time. We want not be treated like criminals for caring too much." She turned to the judge, tears of fury now. "He calls us heroes in the press, but he treats us like thieves, stealing from us every single day. And when my friend, David Chan, compiled the data to prove it, they fired him for violating patient confidentiality. The only data he compiled was time clock records. A new, colder silence descended. This was no longer about rounding errors. This was about retaliation. Judge Judith leaned forward. Mr. Croft, is there a David Chen in your termination records? Croft's lawyer placed a warning hand on his arm, but he ignored it. His patience for this theatricality was clearly at an end. David Chen was a problematic employee who violated company policy. His termination was legal and justified. This is all a sideshow, Judge. A coordinated attempt to extract a settlement from a company trying to do good. Look at them. He finally let his contempt show, his lip curling as he scanned the gallery of tired, angry faces. They're not suing for justice. They're suing for a payday. Because people like them always see a pot of gold when someone like me walks in the room. The air left the courtroom. The cruelty was so casual, so absolute. It was breathtaking. Judge Judith didn't react. She just stared at him, her face an unreadable monument. People like them, she echoed, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried to every corner. You know what I mean, Croft said, waving a hand, fully exposed now. The perpetually aggrieved. The clock watchers. They don't see the big picture. They don't see that without my ruthless efficiency, as they call it, their jobs wouldn't exist. They'd be flipping burgers. I gave them purpose. And this is my thanks. Asterisk, he leaned back, crossing his legs, the picture of a man who had just explained a simple truth to slow children. The silence that followed was volcanic, pressurized, waiting to blow. Judge Judith slowly closed her file. She placed her glasses neatly on the bench. When she looked up, her eyes were like two chips of glacial ice. Mr. Croft, she said, her voice so calm it was terrifying. You've just explained your entire philosophy. Efficiency over humanity. The big picture over the people who paint it. You believe your tough choices give you the right to steal, to threaten, to retaliate. Asterisk, she paused, letting the weight of her words crush the silence. But you've made one critical error. You brought that philosophy into my courtroom. And here, the only picture that matters is the truth. She turned to the bailiff. We're going to need a larger evidence cart, Mr. Croft. You and your counsel are going to sit there, and you are going to listen to every single minute of stolen time, every missed break, every point weaponized against a tired mother. We are going to look at your big picture, one stolen dollar at a time. She brought the gavel down with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. Recess for 15 minutes. Then, Mr. Croft, we begin the autopsy of your efficiency, and I promise you it will be thoroughly inconvenient. Asterisk, the 15-minute recess felt like a pressurized lock. In the hallway, a storm of emotion swirled. Nurses hugged Maria, their whispers a mixture of furious hope and raw anxiety. He's going to close Willow Creek, I know it, a young CNA muttered, her eyes wide with fear. Maria shook her head, gripping her binder like a shield. He's bluffing. She sees him. She sees right through him. But her own knuckles were white inside the courtroom. Vincent Croft's icy composure had returned, but it was thinner now, brittle. He typed furiously on his phone, his lawyer speaking in a low, urgent hiss beside him. Vincent, you cannot speak to the bench like that. You gave her a motive and a personality. Now she's the hero. Croft didn't look up. She's a local judge with a television complex. My PR team is already drafting a statement on the threat to senior care. The court of public opinion is the only one that matters. He finally put the phone down, a cold smile returning. She wants an autopsy? Fine, we'll show her a bloated corpse of entitlement. When the bailiff called them back in, the energy had shifted. The gallery's fear had hardened into a silent, watchful intensity. They were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses. Judge Judith entered, her gaze immediately finding Croft. Mr. Croft, before we proceed with witness testimony, I have some questions about your company's financial viability. You claimed margins are slim? Yet NextGen Health Partners reported a 22% increase in net revenue last year, and your executive compensation package. She glanced at a paper. Increased by 400%? How does that square with being unable to afford legally mandated lunch breaks? Croft's smile was condescending. Your Honor, reinvestment and executive incentive structures are complex financial instruments. Rewarding leadership for improving operational efficiency is how we create the margin to care for patients. You're comparing apples to corporate bonds. I'm comparing dollars to minutes, Judge Judith fired back, her voice losing its patience. Minutes of a nurse's life spent holding the hand of a dying man that you've decided have a value of 0. Let's talk specifics. The time clock optimization? Who authorized it? It's a standard software feature, Croft shrugged, a feature that was manually configured to round in only one direction in the company's favor. The IT director, one of my witnesses, will testify he was ordered to set it that way by your Q. Under your chain of command. The first flicker of unease crossed Croft's face. He hadn't expected the IT layer. Operational decisions are delegated. I run the vision, not the software. Yet the profit from that delegated decision ended up on your balance sheet, funding your incentive structure. Convenient delegation? She turned her head. Ms. Rodriguez, call your first witness. David Chun was a slight, nervous man in a too large suit. He'd been a data analyst for NextGen. Under Maria's gentle prompting, he explained how he'd noticed anomalies in payroll data. He created a model. It wasn't rounding, Your Honor, he said, voice gaining strength. It was systematic truncation. Over 3 years, across just the Willow Creek facility, it extracted over 14,000 unpaid hours. That's over $400,000 in stolen wages. Croft's lawyer objected. Hearsay. This is his own manipulated interpretation. It's data, Judge Judith stated. From your own systems, Mr. Chun, continue. He described how he took his findings to his supervisor, then to HR. A week later, he was called into a meeting with HR and a lawyer. They said my analysis was flawed, that I had accessed confidential patient files to create it. I hadn't. I only used timestamp and payroll IDs. They said I could resign or be terminated for HIPAA violations. They had a separation agreement ready. I was scared. I signed. And what did the agreement give you? Judge Judith asked. 2 months severance and a non-disclosure clause. They said if I ever spoke about this, they'd sue me for damages and report me to the nursing board for ethics violations. His voice broke. I have a license. It's all I have. The gallery seethed. This was the retaliation Maria had mentioned, made flesh. Croft took the cross-examination himself, a calculated move to reassert dominance. He stood, oozing paternal disappointment. Mr. Chun, you were in over your head, weren't you? The data sets are immense. You made an error, and when confronted, you chose to leave with a generous package rather than face disciplinary action. Now you're here, seeking, what, revenge? David. Chun shrank for a moment, then looked at Maria, at the rows of his former colleagues. He straightened his glasses. I'm here because the error wasn't in my data, Mr. Croft. The error was in my conscience. I signed your paper because I was afraid of you. But they, he pointed to the gallery, they're not afraid anymore. They're angry, and they're right. Croft's lip twitched. He'd lost the witness. He switched tactics. A touching speech. But it's irrelevant. He signed a binding settlement. His claims are extinguished. This entire testimony is a violation of that agreement. Judge Judith's voice was like a trap snapping shut. I'll decide what's relevant and what's extinguished, Mr. Croft, and a settlement obtained under threat of malicious professional ruin is not a shield, it's evidence. Sit down. Croft sat, his jaw clenched. The first layer of his defense had just been peeled back, and it stung. The next witness was Janet Miller, the 20-year veteran fired over points. She was in her 60s, her voice steady but her hands shaking with Parkinson's. She described her loyalty, her love for the residents. She described the humiliation of the point system, how calling in to care for her sick husband earned her a point for unreliability. When she described being escorted out by security, her badge taken, in front of residents who cried for her, the courtroom wept with her. Croft's lawyer did the cross this time, trying to be gentle but firm. Ms. Miller, isn't it true your performance had been declining? Lateness, absences? Janet looked at her, eyes clear. I was late 3 times in 20 years. Twice for ice storms, once when my car died. My absences were approved FMLA to care for my dying husband. The points were just an excuse. They wanted me gone because I was top of the pay scale. They could hire 2 new CNAs for what they paid me. She turned to Judge Judith. I gave them my best years, and they threw me out like yesterday's garbage, for efficiency. The words hung there, the human cost of Croft's big picture, now a palpable, weeping presence in the room. Croft could feel the narrative slipping away, from corporate complexity to simple, ugly greed. He scribbled a note to his lawyer, moved to dismiss. Argue arbitration clause, asterisk his lawyer said. Your Honor, all employees signed binding arbitration agreements. This entire class action is improperly before this court. It must be dismissed and sent to private arbitration. It was a technical, procedural Hail Mary, a move to yank the case from this public arena into a confidential, corporate-friendly process. Judge Judith looked at the lawyer, then at Croft, who met her gaze with a newfound smug defiance. Checkmate, his eyes seemed to say. She opened a different file, a thin one. I anticipated this. I reviewed the arbitration clause in the next-gen standard contract. It is indeed comprehensive. She paused, letting Croft's hope solidify. Then she shattered it. However, it includes a carve-out. A specific exclusion for claims arising under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Wage theft. Counselor is a core FLS a claim. Your arbitration agreement doesn't apply here. Motion denied. Asterisk Croft's smugness evaporated. His technical escape hatch had just been slammed shut. He was trapped in her courtroom, in front of her audience, and the autopsy of his empire was just beginning. The cold efficiency he worshipped was now being used against him, point by damning point. And Judge Judith was just getting started with the scalpel. Asterisk the denial of the arbitration motion was a gut punch the gallery felt in their bones. A collective, sharp intake of hope. For Vincent Croft, it was the first true sensation of walls closing in. The sterile, controlled environment of a confidential arbitration was his natural habitat. This public theater, with its weeping witnesses and a judge who quoted wage law from memory, was a disaster. He leaned over to his lawyer, the steel-gray bob now looking frayed at the edges. This is a circus. She's orchestrating a circus. We need to reframe this. Now, his voice was a low, venomous hiss. His lawyer stood for redirect, trying to salvage Janet Miller. Ms. Miller, even if the points were harsh, the policy was applied equally correct. To ensure fairness, Janet's eyes, still red-rimmed, held a surprising fire. Fairness? Was it fair when Mr. Croft here flew to the Bahamas for a leadership retreat on the company jet the same week they cut our shift differential? Is that the fairness you're talking about? The lawyer blinked, thrown. That's not relevant. It is to me. Janet shot back, her voice cracking with power. Every time I wiped a bottom or changed a bedsore dressing, I thought about that jet. You want to talk about fairness? Start there. Asterisk Judge Judith didn't gavel for order. She let the moment breathe. Let the stark contrast, the corporate jet versus the cut shift differential, sear itself into the record. The witness may step down, she said quietly, but the point had detonated. Croft's face was a mask of cold fury. The personal details, the jet. It was a calculated leak meant to enrage the rabble. He scribbled another note. Bring in Reynolds. Now, the next witness for the defense was Dr. Alistair Reynolds, a hired gun with a pedigree from an Ivy League business school in the calm, unassailable demeanor of a man who got paid $800 an hour to call human suffering an externality. He was there to explain the big picture. Croft's lawyer led him through a symphony of jargon: operational scalability, labor cost optimization, the necessity of lean staffing models to ensure long-term facility viability. Dr. Reynolds spoke in smooth, hypnotic paragraphs about market forces and the tragic but necessary choices leadership must make. The alternative, Dr. Reynolds concluded, adjusting his glasses, is inefficiency. Inefficiency leads to higher costs for residents, potential facility closures, and ultimately a reduction in access to care. The policies in question, while perhaps perceived as stringent, are the vertebrae of a system that keeps the entire body alive. He was good. He made that sound like triage. Judge Judith let him finish his polished testimony. Then she leaned forward. Dr. Reynolds, you were hired by NextGen to analyze this case specifically, correct? I was engaged as an independent consultant, yes. Your fee for this engagement is $42,000, is it not? A reasonable rate for my expertise. I'm sure. In your analysis of the lean staffing model, did you factor in the cost of employee turnover? The cost of constant recruiting, training, and the lower quality of care provided by a perpetually new, inexperienced, and demoralized staff? Reynolds paused. Those are softer costs, difficult to quantify precisely. Did you factor in the cost of this lawsuit? The legal fees, the public relations damage, the potential millions in back pay. That is a reactive cost, not an operational one. Did you factor in the human cost, doctor? The cost of a nurse like Janet Miller, with 20 years of institutional memory. Who knows that Mrs. Henderson likes her hand held a certain way when she's afraid? Can you quantify the value of that? Put a dollar figure on the piece of a dying woman? The courtroom was utterly still. Dr. Reynolds shifted. My analysis is based on quantifiable financial data, Your Honor, not sentiment. Sentiment? Judge Judith repeated, letting the word hang, exposed and inadequate. You call it sentiment. I call it the reason these people entered the profession in the first place. A reason your big picture seems to have painted right out of the frame. She turned to Croft. Your witness relies on a model that ignores the very humanity your company claims to serve. A model that calls stolen wages an externality. Is that the heart of your defense, Mr. Croft? That you hired a man to tell you that stealing doesn't count if you're doing it efficiently? Croft stood. He had to retake control. The icy CEO was back, but there was a new, dangerous heat behind his eyes. Your Honor, with respect, Dr. Reynolds is explaining the reality of modern healthcare. A reality you seem determined to ignore in favor of melodrama. He spat the last word. The reality, Judge Judith said, her voice dropping into a zone of deadly calm, is that your company posted record profits. The reality is that you padded those profits by illegally taking money from the pockets of the people who do the actual work. You didn't innovate. You didn't create value. You stole. And you dressed it up in consultant speak to hide the stink. Croft's composure finally fractured. The gentle mask shattered. We created a system that works. He snapped, his voice rising, echoing off the wood panels. A system that delivers care. Without us, these people, he jabbed a finger toward the gallery, are unemployed. And those old people are in state-run warehouses. You want to talk about theft? Talk about the theft of my company's innovation by parasitic lawsuits like this one? You're not a judge. You're a tour guide for a pity parade. The outburst was electric, shocking in its venom. His lawyer pulled out his sleeve, horrified. The gallery recoiled, then rumbled with anger. Judge Judith didn't flinch. She let the echo of his words die completely. The silence she created was more powerful than his shout. When you're done performing, Mr. Croft, we will continue. But since you've brought up parasitic lawsuits and pity parades, let's look at one more piece of evidence. Something I had my clerk pull during the recess. She nodded to the bailiff, who wheeled out a large presentation board covered by a cloth. This is a corporate organizational chart for NextGen, highlighting bonus structures. Show them. The bailiff pulled the cloth. A complex flowchart, but one figure was circled in thick red marker. The annual operational efficiency bonus for the CEO, Vincent Croft. It was tied to a metric: labor cost as a percentage of revenue. The lower the labor cost, the bigger the bonus. Arrows connected this metric directly to initiatives, like time clock optimization and attendance point standardization. The gasp was audible. Maria Rodriguez put a hand over her mouth. Judge Judith stood up. She walked around the bench and stood before the board, pointing at the red circle. This, Mr. Croft, is your big picture. It wasn't about saving facilities or serving seniors. It was a direct financial incentive for you, personally, to drive labor costs down by any means necessary. Every minute you stole, every break you denied, every veteran nurse you fired to replace with someone cheaper. It wasn't an externality. It was a performance target. It went directly into your pocket. She turned to face him. He was pale, utterly still. The architecture of his greed was now a public exhibit. You weaponized policy for personal profit, she said, each word a nail. You called it efficiency. You called it necessity. You hid behind consultants and complexity. But the picture is very clear now, isn't it? This wasn't a business model. It was a robbery. And you were the one holding the bag. She walked back to her seat, the click of her heels the only sound. We'll take a recess. When we return, Mr. Croft, you will have the opportunity to explain this chart to the court, and to explain why every person in this gallery shouldn't see you for exactly what you are. She didn't need to say the word. It hung in the air, more damning than any verdict yet. A thief. Asterisk. The recess was a tomb. No one in the gallery spoke. They just stared at the board with the red circle, the simple, brutal math of their suffering made visible. The operational efficiency bonus. It wasn't a policy or a mistake. It was a motive. A target. It made sense of everything, the rounding, the points, the sudden firings. Vincent Croft wasn't just a ruthless CEO. He was a man who got a direct deposit every time the clock stole a minute of a nurse's life. At the defense table. Croft's lawyer was in full damage control mode, speaking in a rapid, panicked whisper. We need to settle, now, before she enters that chart into evidence. We offer the back pay, no damages. We walk away. Croft didn't look at her. He was staring straight ahead, at the judge's empty bench. His face had lost all color, but his eyes burned with a cold, focused fire. The public humiliation was complete. His philosophy had been diagrammed and mocked. The elegant, untouchable captain of industry was now just a petty thief with a spreadsheet. But a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. No settlement, he said, his voice a dry rasp. Vincent, be rational. She has you on the bonus structure. It's a smoking gun for willful violation. I said no. He turned his head slowly, and the look in his eyes silenced her. It wasn't anger. It was something darker, more calculated. A final, desperate repositioning. She wants a villain? Fine, but I won't be a cheap one. If this is a morality play, then the price of the ticket just went up. When Judge Judith returned, the courtroom felt charged with a new ominous energy. Croft was no longer trying to look bored or superior. He sat perfectly upright, his hands folded on the table. He looked like a man waiting for the executioner, but one who had just whispered a secret to the firing squad. Mr. Croft, Judge Judith began, her tone leaving no room for maneuvering. You have seen Exhibit 14. This court will now enter it into evidence. Do you have any objection? Croft's lawyer stood. Your Honor, the bonus structure is a common legal executive incentive. It proves nothing about intent. Asterisk, it will be entered, Judge Judith stated, the gavel tapping once. Now, you may call your next witness, or you may proceed with your explanation. Croft stood. He didn't call a witness. He adjusted his suit jacket, a last, futile gesture of order. May I address the court directly, Your Honor? You may. He walked slowly to the center of the floor, turning to face her, but also subtly addressing the gallery. The cameras he knew were there. He had shifted from defendant to orator. Asterisk. Your Honor, you have painted a picture. A simple one. Greedy executive. Hardworking nurses. It's a compelling narrative, very cinematic. He paused, letting the condescension drip. But it is a fantasy. You speak of stolen minutes. I speak of safe facilities. You see a bonus. I see a mechanism that kept 12 nursing homes from closing their doors last year alone. He had the room's attention again, but it was a sickened, wary attention. Asterisk. The economic reality you so blithely ignore is this. Medicaid reimbursements are stagnant. Costs are soaring. The profit you vilify is not a yacht fund. It is a reinvestment pool. That bonus you have circled in red is performance-based. And that performance is measured by one thing, keeping the lights on in places where the forgotten go to die. He was good. He was twisting the narrative, making himself the hard-nosed savior. Were the policies strict? Yes. Were they unpleasant? Absolutely. But they were the tourniquet on a bleeding patient. You want to talk about theft? Talk about the theft of dignity from those seniors when a home closes because it can't meet payroll. Where is their day in court? He was building to a crescendo, his voice trembling with what sounded like righteous passion. You sit in judgment of me for making hard choices. Then you judge every family who has a bed for their mother because of those choices. This lawsuit isn't justice. It's suicide. If you rule for them, you are not giving them a victory. You are signing the closure notices for Willow Creek, for Oak Haven, for Sunset Manor. You will put my employees out of work and you will evict their residents. Is that the justice you want on your conscience, Judge? The applause of this gallery today, or the weeping of families tomorrow? He finished, chest heaving slightly. He had thrown the ultimate threat, not as a corporate statement, but as a moral challenge, directly at her bench. The gallery was paralyzed, the horror of his implication sinking in. He'll do it. He'll close them all out of spite. Even Maria looked stricken, her earlier fire dampened by the terrifying thought of the residents being cast adrift. The silence was profound. All eyes turned to Judge Judith. She did not react to his performance. She didn't slam the gavel. She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned forward, her gaze locked on his, and when she spoke, her voice was so quiet, so intensely personal, it felt like they were the only two people in the room. Are you finished, Mr. Croft? He held her gaze, defiant. I have said my piece. Good. She picked up a single sheet of paper from her desk. Because while you were giving your little speech, my clerk was doing something more useful than theatrics. She was checking property records. A new, different kind of dread flickered in Croft's eyes. Willow Creek, Oak Haven, Sunset Manor, and the 9 other facilities you just threatened to close. She looked down at the paper. They are not owned by NextGen Health Partners. They are owned by a separate real estate trust, NHP Properties, LLC. You are the CEO of the operating company NextGen, which pays rent to the property company. The property company, according to its filings, is owned by a holding corporation, which is majority controlled by you personally. She looked up. Do you follow the distinction, Mr. Croft? You don't own the operating company that might be crippled by this judgment, but you do own personally the buildings, the real estate, the assets. The blood drained from Croft's face completely. He hadn't seen this coming. So your threat is hollow, she continued, her voice gaining volume, ringing with finality. If you shut down the operating company out of spite, you don't hurt yourself. You simply stop the rent payments. To yourself. The buildings remain, and the licenses to operate them, which are tied to the beds and the need in the community, not to your corporate shell game, can be transferred. To a nonprofit, to a competitor, to the employees themselves. The gallery began to stir, a wave of understanding and hope. You threatened to hold sick old people hostage to escape accountability for wage theft. You used the most vulnerable among us as human shields for your greed. She stood now, her presence filling the room. That is not a tough choice, Mr. Croft. That is a depraved one. It is the final definitive proof that you have no line you will not cross, no depth you will not sink to, no heart. She picked up the organizational chart, the one with the red circle. This showed us you were a thief. She then pointed directly at him, her finger like a blade. That speech showed everyone you are a monster. And this court does not negotiate with monsters. She turned to the bailiff. The defendant's attempted coercion of this court is noted for the record. We will proceed to closing arguments immediately. And Mr. Croft, she said, her gaze freezing him in place. If you so much as whisper the word closure again, I will hold you in contempt and remand you to a cell to contemplate the difference between a business strategy and a war crime. She sat down. The gavel cracked. Proceed. Vincent Croft did not move back to his seat. He stood rooted to the spot, exposed not just as a thief, but as something far worse in the public eye, a man who had weaponized the elderly. His final desperate play had backfired cataclysmically. He hadn't saved his empire. He had burned its last shred of moral cover to the ground, and in the blinding light of that fire, everyone could finally see him for what he was, empty and utterly irrevocably alone. The closing arguments were a whisper against the thunder that had just passed. Croft's lawyer, her professional veneer cracked, gave a perfunctory recitation of corporate law, her eyes rarely leaving her notes. Maria Rodriguez's lawyer simply said, "The evidence speaks. The law is clear. Justice for once should be simple." There was no need for Judge Judith to retreat to chambers. The verdict had been written in the air, in the stunned silence after Croft's threat, in the surgical precision of her dismantling of his real estate scheme. She looked at the gallery, at the faces of the nurses, the orderlies, the fired, the stolen from. She looked at Maria Rodriguez, sitting tall now, the weight of 3 years not gone, but shared. Finally, she looked at Vincent Croft. He was no longer looking at her, or at anyone. He stared at the wood grain of the defendant's table. A man watching his own reflection dissolve. This case, Judge Judith began. Her voice, resonant and final, was never about complex payroll systems or the hard choices of healthcare. It was revealed in this courtroom to be about something much simpler. A choice between humanity and a spreadsheet, between care and calculation, between dignity and a bonus. She picked up the organizational chart, Exhibit 14. We have here a map of intent, a direct financial incentive to strip value from labor. That is not efficiency. It is exploitation, planned and profitized. She set it down. We heard the defendant, under oath, threaten the well-being of vulnerable seniors to avoid the consequences of that exploitation. That is not leadership. It is moral bankruptcy. She took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the room. The law provides remedies. It is my duty to apply them, but also to send a message. A message that there is a line. That you cannot monetize mercy and sell dignity short. She turned first to the matter of damages. To the plaintiff class, I award full back pay for all uncompensated work, calculated from Mr. Chun's data, which this court finds credible and compelling. I further award liquidated damages in an equal amount under the Fair Labor Standards Act, for the willful nature of the violations. Furthermore, for the retaliatory firing of David Chem and Janet Miller, and for the intentional infliction of emotional distress evidenced in this trial, I award punitive damages. She named a figure. It was not a slap on the wrist. It was a seismic event. A number so large it drew a collective gasp from the gallery, a choke sound from Croft's lawyer. It was a number designed not just to repay, but to rupture. To ensure NextGen's current model could not survive without radical, structural change. This judgment, Judge Judith continued, is to be paid from the assets of NextGen Health Partners. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent injunction. The point system is terminated, effective immediately. All time clock software is to be reset to neutral rounding, under supervision of a court-appointed monitor. Break times will be scheduled and staffed as the law requires. She wasn't finished. She looked directly at Croft, and regarding the threat of closures. The court will appoint a temporary receiver to oversee the financial operations of NextGen, to ensure this judgment is paid and reforms are implemented, and to explore the feasibility of an employee-led or a nonprofit transfer of the operating licenses, as protected under state law. Your holding company's properties will not be a sword you hold over the heads of the sick. They will be a community asset overseen by this court until their future is secured. It was a complete rout. She had not only ruled against him, She had begun the process of dismantling his power structure and handing its pieces to the very people he'd exploited. Asterisk. Finally, she said, her voice dropping into a lower, grave register. This court is referring all evidence in this matter, including the testimony regarding coercion and the deliberate structuring of assets to evade liability, to the State Attorney General's office for investigation into potential criminal fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. The civil court has addressed the theft of wages. The criminal court may have questions about the theft of peace. The last specter materialized. Criminal charges. Not from a local day, but the Attorney General. Croft's head remained bowed but a single. Visible tremor ran through his shoulders. Judge Judith's gaze softened, just for a moment, as she looked at Maria, Ms. Rodriguez. You did more than file a lawsuit. You sounded an alarm. For that, this community owes you a debt. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, crack. The sound was swallowed by an explosion of emotion. The gallery erupted not in cheers, but in a cathartic wave of tears, hugs, and disbelieving laughter. Nurses clutched each other, sobbing with relief. Maria Rodriguez was surrounded, her binder now a symbol of a battle won. Vincent Croft did not move. His lawyer whispered frantically, pulling at his arm, but he was a statue. The bailiff approached, not to escort him out, but to stand by, waiting. Finally, Croft stood. He turned, not toward the door, but toward the gallery. He looked at the celebration, the human tapestry of relief he had tried to monetize, and then threaten. There was no anger left on his face. No defiance. Just a profound, empty disconnection. He had seen his empire valued by the court, and the price was its annihilation. He had seen his own actions reflected back at him. And the reflection was a monster. He walked out, the bailiff following, through a side door that led not to the bustling hallway, but to a quiet, bureaucratic corridor that led to processing. The public spectacle was over. The private reckoning was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, the story did not fade. It became a landmark. The Willow Creek judgment was cited in labor law seminars. The court-appointed receiver began his work, and the first checks, staggering in their amounts, landed in the bank accounts of aides and nurses, many of whom cried at the ATMs. Maria Rodriguez used part of her share to start a small advocacy fund for healthcare workers. She still worked at Willow Creek, but the air was different now. The clocks were honest. The breaks were sacred. The fear was gone. One afternoon, a plain envelope arrived at the courthouse for Judge Judith. Inside was a clipping from a business newspaper. A brief article noted that Vincent Croft had resigned from all his positions and had sold his entire stake in the NHP Properties holding company. The buyer was a consortium of non-profit healthcare groups. There was no note, no apology, just the cold, hard fact of a retreat. The monster had not been redeemed. He had been deleted from the story. Judge Judith read it, then filed it away with the case documents. She felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction. The ecosystem had been rebalanced. The predators had been reminded they were not at the top of the food chain. Justice was. Later that day, a new case was called. A landlord versus a single mother facing eviction. The gallery was different, smaller, scared. The stakes were just as high. Judge Judith took her seat, opened the file, and looked at the wealthy landlord in his crisp suit, already sighing with impatience. She looked at the mother, clutching a folder of her own, her eyes wide with the same desperate hope Maria Rodriguez had once carried. Judge Judith adjusted her glasses. The room quieted. "Counselor," she said, her voice crisp, clear, and utterly devoid of tolerance for nonsense. "Let's begin. And let's stick to the facts. We've already had enough fiction for 1 week." The gavel hovered, ready. The work, after all, was never done.